Welcome everyone to another Bolt from the Blue podcast. This is a special episode in which myself and Ray will talk to Colin Savage about the full detailed report issued by CAS on their decision to overturn the 2-year ban from European football on Manchester City handed down by UEFA and the €10 million fine given for lack of cooperation. We're also going to talk about the response very quickly thereafter from Der Spiegel and the response from Manchester City to that. So there's a lot to get into. So guys, get comfortable, settle down. Before we get into it, let's start off by introducing the two guys who are going to talk us through this. First of all, we have King of the Kippax writer and City Matters Committee member Colin Savage. That is Twitter's Prestwich Blue. And that's Colin. Colin, how are you doing and what have you been up to?
I'm good, thank you. Obviously, spending a lot of time reading the judgment. But if you'll indulge me for one moment, a bit of news came through yesterday, which I think you would be interested in as well, is that BBC Radio Manchester legend Jimmy Wagg has hung up his microphone, certainly on Saturday. Now, if you're listening to this from outside the Manchester area, you might not know who Jimmy is. But basically, for 31 years, Saturday in, Saturday out, and he hasn't missed a Saturday in those 31 years, Jimmy has been the voice of BBC Radio Manchester's Manchester City coverage. But generally the pre-match show and the post-match show, it would be Jimmy's dulcet Lancashire tones on the airways. And no match is complete without getting into your car after the game and turning on BBC Radio Manchester and hearing Jimmy announce, if you've got anything to talk about, and I can't do the accent, if you've got anything you want to talk about today's game, you've got half an hour to do it, so get on those lines quickly. Get your three penn'orthing, which is one of his catchphrases. Having done that show with Jimmy a couple of times, it looks very easy to sit in front of a microphone and just chat away, because he's a very amiable, nice guy. When you sat there with him, when you've got the headset on that he's got, and you hear everything that's going on in the background, and producers in his ear constantly, getting him to shift segments and bring stuff in and telling him to time things properly and cut things down, and you realise how incredibly difficult it is to do that job and what an incredible professional he is. It just won't be the same when we do finally get back to the games and get back in the car. It won't be the same getting switching the radio on, not hearing Jimmy's voice. So he's still staying on BBC Radio Manchester, does a Sunday show, but I think we're all going to miss him on a Saturday. So good luck with whatever comes next, Jimmy.
Yeah, absolutely. Good luck, Jimmy. I mean, he's been just a wonderful professional for all those years. And I was on Twitter and I saw a recorded video by his guests on the show. You had Peter Barnes there, you had various others there. And I think a couple of them said that he deserves 3 testimonials for what he's done. Over 3 decades of fantastic service there. So, yep, I don't know if Jimmy will listen to this, but you've been very much appreciated. Okay, thank you very much, Colin. We're going to hear a lot from you, but we also have someone else with us. Of course, we have the esteemed producer of City Fan TV on YouTube. That's Ray. Ray, how are you and what have you been up to?
Hi, Mike, and hi, Colin. I'm very well indeed. It's been a very, very busy week regarding Manchester City with news, apart from yesterday where sadly we weren't playing in that FA Cup final. There's been lots of transfer talk of Ferran Torres. Looks like that one's done and dusted, just waiting for that to be announced. And with Nathan Ake, that came through late on in the week as well. That City had a bid accepted for him. And there's lots of other bits of transfer gossip as well. And people asking me, is Aguero going to be fit for the Madrid game or the game after that? And so it's been very, very busy trying to keep up with what's going on, as well as trying to read through all 93 pages of this report.
I know. It must be so hard for you, actually, Ray, because I think someone was saying as soon as you release information on Man City, you wake up the next morning and everything's changed. Things are moving fast. We might touch on some of those things at the end of this pod, but guys, that's not exactly what you're here to listen to for this pod. Bolt from the Blue has been inundated with queries about when we're going to have Colin talk about the CAS report. So guys, we've heard from David Conn, we've heard from Stephen Borson and Lloyd at 9320, we've heard from Duncan Castles on his transfer window pod. That was painful to listen to. Many other members of the WhatsApp group of journalists, and now it's Colin's turn. And we're going to give him this platform and we're looking forward to it immensely. So, Colin, how would you like to begin?
Well, I think what I'd like to do is start by just going quickly over the timeline, because that's quite important to get all this into context and to understand some of the nuances. So obviously we know that Sheikh Mansour, via his Abu Dhabi United group, who we refer to as ADUG from now on, took over Manchester City in September 2008. We entered into sponsorship agreements with both Etihad, the airline, and Etisalat, which is the Gulf mobile network provider, in the 2009-10 season. And these arrangements were very relevant to what was in the judgment. Also, we know that financial fair play kicked in the 2011-12 season, and the first assessment was carried out on the first 2 years, which was 2011-12, 2012-13, so the accounts for those 2 years. We know that we failed that assessment. We know that we were sanctioned. We entered into a settlement agreement with UEFA, and that agreement was signed on the 16th of May 2014, which is another important date. And I say that covered the period 2011-12, 2012-13. We exited that settlement agreement in April 2017, I believe, and then everything was quiet until the following year. So October, November 2018, Der Spiegel sensationally published a series of articles based on hacked emails. And these hacked emails cast doubt, certainly in Der Spiegel's mind, on the substance of the sponsorship arrangements we had with Etihad and Etisalat and how those had been set up and financed. The implication being that they had been financed via Sheikh Mansour's ADUG company. And the implication of that was that rather than being commercial sponsorships, which class as revenue and therefore help us towards meeting financial fair play, that they were actually what's called equity investment, so money put in by Sheikh Mansour, which isn't revenue investment. So the overall implication was we'd lied to UEFA about these arrangements and that we'd overstated our accounts, which is potentially quite a serious offence. As a result of this, UEFA's Financial Control Board investigatory chamber, which is the lower chamber, officially commenced investigation in March 2019 into the club. We refused to cooperate with that investigation, as we now know, and they recommended on the basis of that a 2-season ban from European competition and a €30 million fine. That was basically signed, sealed and delivered on the 15th of May 2019, which again, another important date. But quite soon afterwards, we appealed to the Court for Arbitration in Sport in Lausanne in Switzerland. They heard our appeal quite quickly. Obviously, it'd be second week in June. And on the 13th of June, we had the initial verdict that we were cleared of some of the charges, but found guilty of non-cooperation. Basically, the ban had been lifted, but we'd been fined €10 million, so £9 million. On Tuesday afternoon, CAS released their full judgment with all the reasoning behind it. So it's this that we're going to talk about now, because it gives us a lot more background into what's been going on really the last 10 years, really, I guess. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the charges UEFA brought against us and the specific grounds on which we appealed against those charges.
These were serious charges that UEFA had made, and I think that if proven amounted to criminal activity. Would you agree with that, Colin?
Potentially, yes. The core of the charge that we basically misstated our income and our financial accounts. And that is a criminal offence under the Companies Acts. If UEFA's charges were to stick, they would have potentially shown, that we would have, misstated our revenue quite significantly. Now that's a criminal offence. And one of the things we'll talk about is the burden of proof. But the burden of proof of proving that is beyond a reasonable doubt, which wasn't the burden of proof in UEFA making this basically a civil case against us. The other potential implication is that we could have been found guilty by the Premier League, or the Premier League could have been opening an investigation to find us guilty of misstating financial evidence to gain access to European competition. So again, that could potentially have led to action from the Premier League. But yeah, probably the most serious part of the charge was potentially, if proven, we could have been found to have committed criminal acts under the Companies Acts and other.
Yeah, just one other thing, just to set this straight. I know Colin will go into this, but just to explode a little myth that's been circulating among City fans for a long time now regarding the admissibility of the emails. Because they had been launched out into the public sphere, they were considered admissible. And I think you're going to get into that, Colin.
I'm certainly going to get into that, yes. As we said, UEFA brought charges against us, the Valentine's Day massacre, so 14th of February this year. The charges were ratified and passed to adjudication chamber, which is the higher chamber, and we found out the results of those. So the core of UEFA's charges against us were basically that we'd disguised equity investment as sponsorship revenue, in that Adug Abu Dhabi United Group had funded primarily two of the sponsorships, which was mainly the Etihad one and the Etisalat one. That was the core of the UEFA's CFCB charge against us. The other charge, it wasn't an original charge, but came up when the first charges were made, was that we had failed to cooperate with their investigation. And this basically amounted to a failure to produce documents and a failure to produce witnesses at a hearing they conducted the 19th of April 2019. They'd asked for 6 or 7 witnesses to be sent, and we'd only sent 1. So there were 2 charges. To answer, we'll come to those in a minute, but to answer those, we did produce all the documents that UEFA agreed were necessary, and we did produce all the witnesses and more at the CAS hearing that UEFA had originally asked for. So we certainly didn't refuse to cooperate with the CAS hearing. But when we come to that, perhaps I'll talk about what may have been some of our reasons for refusal to cooperate with UEFA. Okay, so those were UEFA's charges. Those were what we were found guilty of. We had 10 separate points of appeal, and I've summarised those. So we'll talk about those, and then I'll answer the case against them. So our appeal, number 1, was based on the core allegation, which was about the Etihad and Etisalat sponsorships being disguised as equity funding, is false. That was it. The core allegation is false. Number 2 was the hacked emails provide no proper factual basis for the adjudicatory chamber's decision. Number 3 was the case against us is based on inference, whereas the adjudicatory chamber declared it was comfortably satisfied, which is a term we'll come back to, that the documents were evidence of these arrangements. City's number 4 assertion was that their evidence would clearly demonstrate that Etihad and Etisalat met their sponsorship obligations in full, received the valuable rights due to them under those arrangements in full, and that none of them were funded by Adug. Number 5 was the case was commercially irrational. And what they meant by that was, why would we let Etihad pay 8 million for sponsorship rights that were worth a lot more than that? So UEFA's own view, apparently, according to the documents, was that the Etihad sponsorship arrangements could be valued anywhere between 40 million and 77 million pounds or euros, I forget which. So basically, why would we give them that for 8 million euros? Number 6 was that the alleged breaches are in any event settled, and they meant that they were disposed of as part of the 2014 settlement agreement, and in any respect are time barred. Number 7 was something a little bit esoteric, but basically it said that the accounting and accrual basis was the basis of the 7th point in our appeal. Didn't see this as particularly relevant. But what this refers to is how we recorded these sponsorships. So there was a lot of noise about we got a lot of money from Etihad in certain years and not in other years. And what the accrual basis of accounting says was, basically, if we agreed a 4-year contract for X amount, let's say it was 55 million a year from Etihad, and over those 4 years they paid us 220 million in accordance with the contract, how we took the cash was irrelevant as long as we accounted for it in the right way. So basically that said, as long as Etihad got exactly the same consideration in each of those 4 years, we'll have shown it as 55 million rather than recording just the cash flow. So a bit of an esoteric point, but I think it was designed to show that Etihad got an ongoing consideration for their sponsorship money. Point number 8 was about the alleged non-cooperation by the club, so the club disputed that. Point number 9 was the Club Financial Control Board abused its obligation of due process. So basically UEFA CFCB hadn't properly followed its own process, which rendered the findings invalid. And the final point was the proportionality of the sanction. So they felt we'd been punished too heavily. So those were our 10 points of appeal. So they covered really all the major ground. They answered UEFA's points about the sponsorships. They answered UEFA's points about non-cooperation, and they added 1 or 2 more of their own. So what I'll do, if you like, unless you've got any questions at this point.
Well, Colin, just before you continue, could you just settle one thing for us? There have been allegations by certain journalists that City effectively picked 2 out of the 3 on the panel.
Yeah, I've seen those, of course. And it was a fairly shameful misrepresentation of what happened. Yeah, good point. Just to explain the way CAS arbitration panels work, Rule 40.2 in their procedure manual says that the participants should ideally agree beforehand on the composition of the panel. And normally the panel will be made up of either 1 or 3 arbitrators. And the standard process appears to be that each party picks what it wants to represent it. So, and there are a list of approved arbitrators for football under CAS. I think there are about 100 of them. They're not allowed to have any conflicts of interest. So, we couldn't pick someone who was, say, a City fan or had worked for us or something like that. So the procedure is that each of the parties, us and UEFA, we have a free choice from that list of who sits on the panel. So that's 2 out of the 3 catered for. And the other ideal scenario is that the 2 parties agree on agree on the chairman of the panel. So we're picking 2 ordinary arbitrators, and we picked this Andrew McDougall, who was a Canadian guy based in France, but had done some work for Etihad, which doesn't render him a conflict of interest, clearly. UEFA picked Professor Ulrich Haas, who's a professor of law at Zurich University, and then it was a case of who picked the chairman of the panel. Now, what the CAS judgment does say is that Manchester City suggested, that was the word they used, suggests, Portuguese judge Rui Botica Santos. Now, UEFA were quite at liberty to object to that choice. They were quite at liberty to make an alternative suggestion of their own, but they agreed. They agreed that Senor Santos would be a suitable person to be chairman. Now, the procedure, in case the parties can't agree on this, is that the CAS president will pick the chair of the panel. But to suggest that City somehow chose 2 of the 3 is nonsense, because to agree on something, one or other has got to suggest it. Now, I don't know if there's any custom where the appellant or the respondent has the first pick, has the first kind of pick, if you like. But basically, one name was put forward, both parties approved it. So it's quite clear UEFA weren't railroaded into this. UEFA had an entirely free choice about whether to agree to Rui Botica Santos or not. So hopefully that kills that one stone dead. Okay, so I think one of the key points was obviously admissibility of the email. So let's talk about that first. Now, the Portuguese judge in the case of the hacker Rui Pinto had directed as part of that case that the emails could not be used in any jurisdiction. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to tell another legal jurisdiction what not to do and what not to do. So CAS had to make an immediate ruling on the admissibility of the emails, because this obviously is fairly crucial. If UEFA aren't entitled to use the emails of evidence, then the whole case collapses. And what became clear from the full CAS judgment was that UEFA, in opening its initial investigation, had relied solely on the 6 hacked emails. In fact, it was 7 emails, and 2 were stitched together to give a somewhat distorted impression of what the emails are trying to say.
And that's six emails out of 5.5 million. That's
7 emails out of 5.5 million, yeah. Yeah. And as we've said all along, I've said it till the cows come home. These emails were all, even before this started, as soon as this was started, these emails were taken out of context and were very selective. And basically, CAS confirmed that, and UEFA confirmed that. 7 out of 5.5 million. So it was quite, because they were the core of the case. Beside the non-cooperation, then obviously it was quite important to decide whether they were admissible or not. CAS took what to me, I'm not a lawyer, but it took to me what seemed to be rather a strange view. So Swiss law allows the publication of stolen documents, the use of stolen documents, if it's considered to be in the public interest of revealing the truth or words to that effect. So they applied that case to it and decided that on that basis alone, it was correct to allow them to be used, to be relied on. But the other basis they stated was that anyway, they were already in the public domain. Now, to me, this is slightly odd, because why were they in the public domain? Because they'd been stolen. Now, if you kind of take a kind of a relevant analogy, if you like, if I buy a car off eBay or an advert that I later find to be stolen, or a mobile phone that I later found to be stolen, and I didn't know it was stolen at the time, I've not committed any criminal act myself, but the owner of that car or phone or other object is entitled to have their property returned to them, and I am out of pocket unless I can get the money back from the person who stole it. There's no criminal, unless they can prove you had criminal intent or knowledge that the items were stolen. There's no criminal issue as regards you buying them in good faith. However, if you buy a car or a laptop or a phone that you suspect or know has been stolen, in the UK anyway, you have committed a criminal offence. And I would imagine pretty much the same applies in Swiss law or any other law. you buy something stolen that you know is stolen, and you then knowingly buy it, you have committed a criminal offence. Now, if we look at the emails, they've been published in Der Spiegel, and it was known they were hacked emails. So to me, it's very odd that UEFA were allowed to rely on the fact that they were in the public domain when they knew they were effectively handling stolen goods, if that makes sense.
It does, Colin, but I do note that in the document, City always referred to these documents as hacked. But when Cass talked about them, they called them leaked. There's quite a big difference, isn't there?
Well, the word City used and always used in the document was criminally obtained, which I think has more of an impact than hacked. So that obviously criminal obtained quite specifically points to a criminal offence having been used to obtain these documents, which we now know. And incidentally, there was a note in the CAS judgment that explains how these were obtained. So it would appear someone at City opened an email they thought came from UEFA, but in fact wasn't. It was a very clever what they call spear phishing attempt. Now, this introduced a piece of malware which allowed the hackers to gain access to City's full email library, basically. So again, that's the first proper indication of how these emails came to be hacked. Now I think I mentioned in the last pod we did on this that Martin Ziegler of the Times reported that a source at City had told him they were convinced the Qataris had done it. It was obviously a very clever attempt, but that's the way many of these things, we open an email, click on a document that seems genuine, click on a link, when perhaps a cursory examination of the sender of the email and a proper look at their email address would tell you it wasn't genuine. So there was a complete divergence of views between City and the CFCB on these emails, and again, CAS came down on the leaked emails, which I think was wrong. They could have found perhaps a better way of expressing it. Now, the funny thing about this was, if there's anything funny about it, was that City still denied the veracity of these emails. So at the time UEFA investigated them, we'll come on to this in a minute, they refused to confirm that the emails were valid, were true emails. And they did all the way up to the CAS hearing. But what they came up with was quite almost, for those who watch Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister, a kind of a form of words that I think Sir Humphrey Appleby would have been quite proud of. They made no admission that the emails were genuine, but they would proceed on the assumption that they were. So we don't, so we're not saying these emails are genuine, but we'll pretend they are for the basis of this investigation and appeal, which I thought was quite funny. But basically, the Swiss court decided on two grounds, one of which was probably reasonable, that the emails were in the public domain. The emails were releasing the emails within the public interest, or using the emails in the public interest. Arguable, but fair. The second was they were already in the public domain, which I don't think was a very fair way of doing it.
And I think, Colin, also it's pretty clear that City knew that this was likely to be rejected. They'd obviously, considered this, and they probably prepared for the likelihood that it wasn't going to be as simple as having the whole case thrown out on those grounds right at the beginning. So it was a possibility that would be rejected. This kind of has to be tested. Each use of the Swiss law, which the hearing was heard under, these documents have to meet certain tests, and it was quite. They would have known the possibility that their claim would have been rejected, but it was well worth, asking the CAS panel to rule on the test. Yeah, worth a try.
You don't ask, you don't get.
Well, yeah, that's right. It was, City maintained all along that these were criminally obtained. There's a legal principle which talks about before, the fruit of the poison tree. There was the judgment of the Portuguese judge in the Rui Pinto case, which was quoted in the document. So in any legal argument, you'll make arguments that may or may not be rejected. But actually, I'm pleased that the argument was rejected, because then actually the case could be considered. The City wanted this case heard, really. They wanted this case heard in front of an independent panel. They've always said that. And having been heard, as we'll talk about towards the end, it was UEFA's case was comprehensively rejected. So okay, we'll go through the 10 points, really. So as we said, point 1 was the core allegation about Etihad and Etisalat sponsorships actually being disguised equity funding by Abu Dhabi United Group was false. Now, that was quite an interesting one. I mean, that was the core of it. So we know now that was found in our favour. But there's a lot more to that, which I'll talk about. So number 2 was that the hacked emails provide no proper factual basis for the adjudicatory chamber's decision. Now, again, this was an interesting one because, again, there was kind of what seemed to me a couple of contradictory parts in the CAS judgment. On the one hand, CAS said, yeah, based on these emails, the adjudicatory chamber, or the CFCB, were quite entitled to had justification for opening an investigation. But actually, when they opened the investigation and when it all went to CAS said there wasn't enough evidence in there. It wasn't enough evidence in there to bring home their case. So again, they're saying one thing, it seems clear that there's a potential, something potentially needs to be investigated quite seriously. But no, there was nothing in there which gave grounds. We'll talk about that again, perhaps in a minute. So again, a little bit of contradiction in there, and it's perhaps moving on to the third point, which kind of links all that in, is the case against us was based on inference, whereas the adjudicatory chamber declared it was, and again, used the phrase, comfortably satisfied that the documents were evidence of these arrangements. And this led to a whole series of arguments about what was the burden of proof in this case, in this appeal. Citi had asked for the burden of proof to be set higher. Now, obviously, a civil case and a criminal case, as we've alluded to, are different. So in a criminal case, guilt has to be beyond all reasonable doubt. In a civil case, it's generally on what we call the balance of probabilities in the UK, or in England anyway. Whereas in Swiss law, I think they use the term comfortably satisfied, which is pretty much analogous to on the balance of probabilities. So, there has to be a comfortable argument that what someone is alleging is actually true. And Citi had said, there was an argument about this, and CAS ruled that Citi's point about a higher standard of proof was not necessary, but the standard of comfortably satisfied was the one that would be applied. So, everything has to be judged on that basis. So that was the outcome of that. So we get on to point 4 now, which is really the core of this. The core of one of UEFA's main allegations. And Citi maintained that the evidence clearly demonstrates, to use their words, that Etihad and Etisalat met their sponsorship obligations in full, received valuable rights in respect of them, and that none of them were funded by Abu Dhabi United Group. So Sheikh Mansour, Abu Dhabi United Group. Now, there were 2 sides to this, and we'll take them separately. So we'll take the Etisalat one first, because there's a number of points around that one. So both arrangements were signed in 2009-2010 season. I think we signed the Etisalat one first and then the Etihad one. So late in 2009 we signed Etisalat. Early in 2010 we signed the Etihad agreement. And David Conn, shamefully, as he's a trained lawyer, tried to allude to the fact that the contract wasn't signed until 2015. And he used the term, it was backdated. As a trained lawyer, he should know that often in complex contracts, you sign what's known as a heads of agreement, term sheet, which is basically an agreement, a broad agreement that the contract will go ahead, and a broad agreement as to the basis on which it will go ahead, and that's legally binding. And the first terms of agreement with Etisalat was signed in, I think, February 2010. The full contract wasn't signed. We went through a number of renegotiations with Etisalat, which varied the terms on which we provided the sponsorship. So, perimeter advertising, program advertising, all that sort of stuff. The final contract was indeed not signed until 2015, but it related to a terms of agreement which was agreed in 2012. And UEFA tried to make great play of the fact that what some of these weren't signed, and Citi countered with the fact that, well, actually, quite a lot of their sponsorship agreements weren't necessarily signed by both parties, but all were considered legally binding and were put into action. So the specific case around Etisalat concerned payments made under those agreements in 2012, 2013. Whereas Etihad, a little bit confusing and I don't quite understand it, I can make a guess at this. Etihad, it talked about the relevant period, and that was 2012-13, 2013-14, 2015-16, missing out 2014-15. And basically the contract with Etihad was that they would pay us something like £220 million over that period, the 4-year period, but only 3 named, for relevant sponsorship arrangements. I don't understand why, there's nothing specific as to why 2014-15, but from what I think happened is that Etihad made an arrangement to provide us with a sum of money over a 4-year period. So it wasn't named specific years, but some of that money, for cash flow reasons, was advanced. So let's take an argument that we agreed a contract for 55 million over 4 years. So that's 220 million in total. Now, let's say we took 70 million in those 3 relevant years, and we only took 10 million in the 2014 year, which isn't named. Because a lot of this revolved around what did Etihad pay, which was the 8 million, and what did someone else pay, which was the 59.5 million. So let's presume that these other 59.5 million payments were actually paid in those 3 named years, but Etihad only paid the 8 million in the 2014-15. That's the only reason I could think of why the sponsorship was detailed in that way, with 3 years named and 1 year in the middle missed out. Again, offer Mr. Castle. Was it Nick Harris? But they're all one, aren't they? They all merge into one. Harris, the 2 Harrises and Castles and Delaney and all the rest.
Like a hydra, isn't it? Or whatever.
Yeah.
Is with 8 heads.
It's like a snake with different heads. Guarding the gates to Hades or wherever it was. Anyway, let's leave them aside. I think it was Nick Harris tried to claim that this sponsorship agreement was only over 3 years, therefore you divided 220 million by 3. I think you divided 220 million by 4, giving 55 million a year on average. But in one of those years, we didn't bring forward any cash. So basically, we called off cash, but not necessarily in a linear fashion, if that makes sense. And the Etihad arrangement was paid, as we say, there were 2 separate payments for this, one for 8 million, one for 59.5 million. And UEFA presented that as proof that there were someone else paying the Etihad money. Okay, now City were able to produce evidence and witnesses, including Sheikh Mansour himself got involved in this. I thought wrongly that Sheikh Mohammed, the Crown Prince, had testified, but I'd made a kind of an incorrect assumption. So they got the former chief executive Etihad, the former president, the former commercial chief operating officer, the former commercial director, all to testify that Etihad paid these arrangements in full, and that the difference between the 2 payments was that Etihad paid 8 million out of their own marketing budget, but this 59.5 million came from what they call central sources. And they described central sources as shareholders, bankers, other finance providers, and any other third party who they could have got money from. So basically 8 million was marketing, the rest came from central sources. Now, we've had the discussion before, this document exists that claims that the Abu Dhabi Executive Council largely funded or fully funded the Etihad arrangement. Actually, that was specifically, or there was an allusion to that in the CAS document, which said that they didn't think that was the case. So that's fine. So in view of the number of witnesses, and City were able to provide accounting evidence that they'd issued Etihad with invoices for the relevant amounts. They were able to show the flow of cash through their accounts. And most importantly, Sheikh Mansour testified that he had not made or authorized any payments to any sponsor from Abu Dhabi United Group at any time. And that was even backed up by an investigation Ernst & Young had done into all payments that Abu Dhabi United Group had made of £250,000 and over. So the intention, it wasn't an audit as such, a full audit, but the intention was if any large payments had gone out, then this investigation, which we'd asked for and paid for, by the way, would have found those payments. And the investigation came back quite clearly that they hadn't found any such payments. And even the total of payments under 250k came to around 21 million. And that would not have been enough, even in total, to satisfy the alleged payments, which were somewhere in the region of 175 million. So we defeated that case quite clearly. The weight of evidence. Kaz basically said we'd have to assume, if we were to take UEFA's case, that these were funded by ADUC, we'd have to presuppose that there was a conspiracy to do, though. There was no evidence of that. That a number of key witnesses, in public positions of trust within Abu Dhabi lied. There was no evidence of that. And there was no evidence in the email that any third party had been involved, because it was, apart from a mention of Arbar in one of those 6 emails, they were all internal emails. So again, that was another finding from Kaz that detailed as to why they felt UEFA hadn't made their case on the ADUC funding of the sponsorship agreements. So again, that was fairly clear. The Etisalat one was slightly different, and it touches on another point, which is about the time barring and the settlement agreement. So I'll go on to those first. I'll come back to Etisalat. So City had made a point, and that there's kind of point 6 in their submission to Kaz, was that the alleged breaches are in any event settled, which is referring to the 2014 agreement, and time barred. So there's 2 sides to that. Did the settlement agreement represent full and final closure on this case? And basically on this, Kaz said, well, no, it didn't, because there was nothing in the agreement, and the text wasn't published, I don't think, but there was nothing in the agreement which suggested it was a full and final settlement. So basically, they felt that UEFA were entitled to revisit the period covered by the settlement agreement if new evidence came to light that suggested there was a material inaccuracy in what we told them. And they decided that based on what the Spiegel emails have said, and we're back to this case of whether should UEFA have relied on them, yes or no. But basically, on the basis of those emails, yes, there was a case for going back to that settlement agreement, and there was nothing in the settlement agreement that would stop them doing that. So that was number one. So yes, they could go back and reopen it. The second one was the time barring. This was an interesting debate. So UEFA's own rules, the FFP rules, say that prosecution of any alleged breaches is time barred after 5 years. And probably one of the major things that's come out of this is that clause may get tightened up a bit, because this led to an argument between City and UEFA on what that meant. So obviously 5 years is 5 years, but the crucial argument was when was the date. And I think we've had these discussions before. Stefan Borson on 9320 has been over it in excruciating detail. But we've looked at it from when did this start, and therefore when does the 5 years end? So we know, I talked about this earlier, we know that the settlement agreement was concluded on the 16th of May 2014. We know that UEFA, CAS issued got that right. So the case was passed from the investigative game to the adjudicator agreement on the 15th of May. So that's 5 years less 1 day after the original settlement agreement was found. And the CAS ruling made clear that UEFA knew that date was significant, because that's the latest date they could have applied the 5 year statute of limitations. So we've always thought of it as going forward. So we find a date. When did the breach occur? And were UEFA entitled to bring these charges because they were outside the 5 year time limit? And CAS went about it a slightly different way, which is quite clever, as legal people tend to do. They said, well, hang on, you brought the charges on the 15th of May 2019. So what does that include and what does that exclude? And basically they decided that the passing of the case to the adjudicatory chamber, after the investigation had been done and the charges had been laid, classed as prosecution. So basically that was the end of the 5 year time limit. Anything that had occurred before 5 years, so basically anything that occurred prior to the 16th of May 2014 was therefore time barred. Does that make sense? Have I explained that adequately? Because it's quite important.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. You're absolutely right. There was a considerable debate about the start and end points of the 5 years, but I think that ruled a lot of the accusations to Man City about the Etisalat.
Well, yeah, I'm coming
thing out of it completely, and that's what all of the journalists were hanging their hats on, weren't they?
What was the impact of this decision? Well, basically anything that occurred after 15th of May 2014 was in scope. Anything that occurred before that was out of scope. So our 2014 accounts were filed after the 16th of May 2014. So they were in scope. The 2013 accounts weren't, and therefore the 2012 accounts weren't. Therefore, they were out of scope. UEFA actually made a very bizarre argument in relation to this. They said, well, because when you put your 2014 accounts in, because I said before, FFP ran on started off on a 2-year basis, 2012, 2014, then moved on to a 3-year basis, 2012, 2013, 2014. And UEFA made a rather bizarre and hopeful argument that because 2014 was in scope, therefore 2012 and 2013 should also have been in scope, because we had to provide those comparative figures to meet financial fair play. And Kaz said this was nonsense, because those figures had already been supplied, and we really had to take the date that they were first applicable to as being the date they were applied. So you couldn't rely on this, otherwise you could go back basically 7 years.
Yep.
And that wasn't on. That basically broke UEFA's own rule on the statute of limitations being 5 years.
Were they just trying to clutch at any straw they could find?
Yes. Yeah, basically. And I'll tell you why. Let's go back to this now and go back to Etisalat, because when UEFA had originally examined our books in 2014, they found that the payment of the Etisalat sponsorship had come from Abu Dhabi United Group. So there was an audit trail from Abu Dhabi United Group to City, but an invoice raised on behalf of Etisalat. Now, City's explanation at the time was that Etisalat didn't have the cash, had agreed to this, but didn't have the cash. Therefore, ADUG fronted it, and that in 2015, I think, Etisalat had settled up with ADUG. So basically, it's lend us the money, shaky, we're a bit skint, and we'll pay you back when we get it back. We'll pay you back when we've got the money. And that's what happened. And City certainly suggested, it's in the CAS judgment, that City suggested that the adjudicatory chamber were happy with this arrangement. Whether they were or not, I don't know, but City suggested that they'd spoken to the adjudicatory chamber about this arrangement and they had accepted it. So yes, Etisalat funding had appeared to come from Abu Dhabi United Group, but Abu Dhabi United Group had later claimed the money back from Etisalat, and therefore, in the kind of, when you look at this end to end, Etisalat had paid for their sponsorship and received consideration for it. But those are the allegations, because Etisalat made those payments, the disputed payments 2012, 2013, those were time barred. But it seems that it doesn't matter, because City and the adjudicatory chamber at the CFCB had already agreed that that was a settled matter. Again, any journalist trying to say we got on a technicality because some stuff was time barred. Yes, some stuff was time barred, including the earliest payments from, so anything prior to 2014 from Etihad. But we know the principle of the Etihad arrangement. So nothing went on before 2014 that went on after 2014, as far as we can see. So that's not relevant. The Etisalat payments were relevant. They were time barred. CAS couldn't look at those. But it seems that City and the adjudicatory chamber had agreed that that was a settled matter and therefore not up for grabs. So this whole nonsense of time barring, hiding a whole can of worms, again, seems to be nonsense. So that covered those. So we're then on to the other biggie. Let's take them in a slightly different order. So what City claimed was that the CFCB had abused its obligation of due process. So basically, they'd not finished their investigation prior to handing it over to the adjudicatory chamber. And this was an interesting one. There was a whole set of discussions about whether Etihad and Etisalat were related parties or not. I thought this was a slightly bizarre argument for City to hang their hat on, because, again, I've explained before, City were arguing they weren't related parties, and this has an impact, again, on their financial statements, because they're not declared as related parties in the financial statements. So City has maintained all along that Etihad, Etisalat were not related parties, which implies that UEFA were trying to imply that they were UEFA related parties. But if UEFA had succeeded in proving they're related parties, it's kind of a win and a loss, because then it means the whole issue, as we said before, of who funds these, as long as they're at fair value. And one of the key phrases in the CAS document was that it is accepted that Etisalat and Etihad were not related parties and that they were transacted at arm's length at fair value. So that one's off the table. But if UEFA were trying to claim that they were related parties, then that completely undermines their case about who funded them. Because if they were related parties and the transaction were at fair value, which they seem to have been, then it's irrelevant who funds them. They can be funded by related parties. But it's quite possible City were trying to avoid a little bit of embarrassment in this respect. And, there was still a chink of light into this accusation that the financial statements were incorrect. Now, as you know, I've said all along that perhaps City's way out of this would have been to say, for financial fair play purposes only, we'll accept, according to UEFA's definition, that Etihad is a related party, and then stuff it. It doesn't matter who funds it, as long as you agree it's fair value. But we didn't go down that path, and it's now all been put to bed. So that seemed to be the key. There was stuff about the leaks as well, of course. But CAS rejected both of those. It rejected the leaks one on the grounds that the decision had been made anyway. Again, some of those leaks came out so quickly. But, when you've got a process which is bound by confidentiality, to me, it doesn't matter if decisions have been made. It's confidential. So we know that Tariq Panja in the New York Times, we know that I think the Sun was mentioned. I can't remember who the third party was that was mentioned. But anyway, they were leaking stuff. But CAS decided that those decisions had been made. So they weren't leaking kind of ongoing discussions. They were leaking firm decisions. So they rejected it on that basis. They rejected the due process on another interesting basis, which was basically that forget what happened in the past. This appeal, this CAS appeal, is now a new process. So anything that UEFA may or may not have done in their handling of it is off the table. You're starting with a clean slate. So nothing UEFA has done or not done has prejudiced this hearing. So forget about that. That's not a problem. So again, it was one of those where they found against us, but it didn't matter because this hearing started here. So it's a bit of a strange one, again, for City to protest on. So let's go back to the biggie, and the one we actually did get fined on, which was the non-cooperation by the club. So when UEFA CFCB turned up, they formally opened their investigation. I think we said in late in March 2019, the emails having appeared a few months prior to that, late in 2018. So when UEFA turned up, they demanded certain things. They demanded certain emails. They demanded emails that might be linked to these emails. They demanded to talk to key witnesses, and we refused, basically. And that was the basis of the non-cooperation charge. Now, again, it's made clear in the CAS documents that City weren't doing this capriciously. They weren't doing it to be purely obstructive, but they were doing it on legal advice. So their external legal advisors, and presumably the internal ones as well, but buoyed up by advice by the external legal advisors, which are either Pinsent Masons or Freshfields or both, suggested that there were no grounds for them to cooperate on. So again, it doesn't particularly go into detail on this, but I'm guessing from City's point of view, this was on the fruit of the poison tree principle, i.e. these emails were hacked and therefore not admissible. The email that UEFA made inferences from them which weren't justifiable, that they had no right, therefore, to even confirm that the emails were genuine and therefore release what might have been genuine emails. And they certainly appear to have thought that Monsieur Leterme was on a fishing expedition in asking for a whole series of unspecified emails, which might or might not have been connected to some of the emails published. And I think, in legal proceedings, this process of discovery, you're allowed a fairly wide remit, but you're not allowed to go on a fishing expedition to try and find anything that might be potentially useful to your case in some way or other. Now, one of the criticisms of CAS was City could have ended this by giving everything to the adjudicatory chamber that UEFA the investigatory chamber had asked for. Now, again, we don't know why City took this view at this point. I would suggest they had solid legal grounds to do so, which does make you wonder about whether they'll appeal. But they didn't choose to do so. But they did do so when it came to the CAS hearing, of course, which was basically a year later. So CAS were quite critical on that point. But there's nothing too much in the document which really gives the background to that, other than that we said no, they asked, we said no, they asked again, we said no, and they dropped an Article 56 charge on us on the basis of that.
Can I ask you a question here, Colin, then?
You can.
Would UEFA have ever seen these documents? So City refused to give them to UEFA. They give them to CAS. CAS have inspected them. Would UEFA have ever seen them then? They've never seen them, I take it.
UEFA have seen our evidence now, yes.
Yeah, okay. That's
because we had to provide documentation to CAS on to support our appeal, and UEFA had to supply documentation to support their case. So yes, each side saw each other's submissions, but there was still a dispute about a run. This is very interesting, actually. It takes me on to another interesting point. There was still a dispute. We provide virtually everything that UEFA had originally asked for, but to CAS, not to UEFA. I mean, I'm guessing there was a lot of suspicion at City as to UEFA's motives, and there was certainly no intention of giving UEFA the ammunition to shoot them with. So basically, UEFA's turned up with a few gun parts and said, hang on, we need the rest of the parts and we need the bullets to go in this gun to shoot you with. Well, the answer was always going to be no. And that answer, again, let's stress this, was on legal advice. It wasn't just, no, and our solicitors were saying, hang on, you better tell them. Because if you're sat in a police interview room with your solicitor, the solicitor might say to you as a suspect, I think you better say, you better answer that question. And he might say, you better not, I don't think you should answer that question. But there are times when a solicitor will say to their client, I think you should answer that question. Why we didn't answer UEFA's question, we can only guess that. Whether it's suspicion of UEFA's motives, whether it was purely on the fruit of the poison tree principle. We simply don't know. But I'm sure that will all come out in time, in some way. But yeah, we gave all the evidence, apart from one run of emails, and this was quite interesting. A couple of interesting points. UEFA had asked, as I say, they wanted all emails which were associated with one of the emails, or one or two of the emails highlighted in Der Spiegel. So basically what you might see is a fishing expedition. Give us everything that might be related to this email. City's counter argument was, well, no, we're not going to do that because it would take a hell of a long, to do that properly would take a hell of a length of time to actually go through. And they've pinched 5.5 million documents. We've got to go through all those documents potentially and find anyone that might be associated with the email in question. And we said we weren't prepared to do that. It was going to take a lot of time. Now, one point that CAS did make that was critical of UEFA, which leads me on to the next point, was UEFA asked for that and we said no. UEFA asked for that a second time, we said no. UEFA could have asked for that and said, okay, we'll wait. But UEFA didn't. Because obviously it was in our interest to bring this case as quickly as possible. But UEFA has said to CAS they wanted to be in a position where a decision was made prior to July the 10th, which presumably would have been the cut-off date for entry into next season's Champions League. Now, you can understand our interest in wanting this cleared as quickly as possible, because, this kind of brings us into the Hateful Eight, Noncy Nine, whatever you want to call them, who wrote to UEFA requesting that any attempt to suspend the ban should be denied. In the end, we didn't make any attempt to suspend the ban, so that whole argument was completely moot, and I think they made a complete fool of themselves in doing that. But some of our enemies showed their hand in that, which is never a bad thing, really. But we never made any application to suspend it, which was, I think, a calculated gamble in some ways, but one that paid off in the end. So you can say, you can understand us wanting to bring this to a head as quickly as possible. But then you think, why were UEFA so keen to do this? Because CAS said UEFA wanted, as I say, UEFA wanted a decision to be made on this case prior to July the 10th, which just about got there. But because that was obviously prior to the season all finishing. So the question is, were UEFA more interested in kind of striking a blow or more interested in getting to the truth? And that, for me, is one of the most interesting things, which almost hasn't been talked about by anyone. I've not listened to Stefan on this, so he might have mentioned it, but UEFA seem more keen to do this quickly and strike a blow by getting us banned from the CL than to actually make their case stick 100%. So they've got these 7 two-doctored emails, 6 emails they're purely relying on. They hope we would shoot ourselves in the foot and give them all the evidence we need. We didn't. Yet there, even when we went to CAS and we still say we wouldn't provide this run of emails, they said, okay, that's fine, we're happy with that. Why? Why were they so keen to make this case stick? Why were they make so keen to make this case, to get this case through so early? I mean, we can look at this in all sorts of different ways, can't we? Perhaps we can talk about that. My feeling is potentially that, if they don't get it through, then natural justice means we have to take part in the Champions League next season. That gives us income, and that gives us lots of time, potentially lots of time to defend this case. On the other hand, if they hit us quickly, they get this. They get our appeal overturned. We get a 2-game ban. We've said before, haven't we? That cripples us for a number of seasons, not just for 2 seasons. It potentially cripples us for a number of seasons to come, both in the short and the longer term. So I look at UEFA's desire to reject what they thought was crucial evidence to get this done quickly as a calculated risk, to strike a blow, to kind of land a blow on us while we weren't looking, almost, you might call it, knowing that if they left it any longer, their chances might be we would potentially survive that. So that's kind of very interesting for me. I say no one else has really picked up on that. Why were UEFA so keen to see this through so quickly and prepared to forego what they clearly saw as key evidence to achieve that? Quite bizarre in my view.
We're pressurising them to move quickly.
Yeah, exactly. That's
skullduggery in the background.
That's what I take from this. Yeah, maybe being tinfoil hat time, but that's what I take from this.
I mean, I'm not sure if my years are right. Can I suggest? I've not thought about this before, Colin, but can I suggest that some teams that might not have been in the top 4, needed City to be kicked out, so that if they finish 5th or 6th or whatever, because I think they were 6th at the time, that would give them a route into the Champions League, which they needed, because otherwise they'd lose maybe 25 million.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Yeah.
And they'd lose the Champions League money, and that could have crippled. It would have. If United had not got in the Champions League this season, it would have semi-crippled them, because they're already taken out a £140 million loan, because that's what they're losing a lot of money from match day and everything else. So it could easily, in my small mind, be somebody just obviously looking out for their own interests. I mean, it's not as if Man United have got any body in UEFA that used to be their chief executive or anything. That's fighting their cause.
Or a head of communications or a head of legal.
No.
At UEFA, all of whom were ex-United employees. That is a brilliant point, Ray. I take my hat off to you. I hadn't actually thought of that, but yes, UEFA were more keen to make this stick quickly than make it stick properly.
Yeah.
And in fact, just to kind of round this off, in terms of the alleged non-cooperation, obviously we were found guilty of that, but basically on 2 grounds. One, we didn't provide the witnesses that UEFA asked for in the April 19 investigation. Now, interestingly, Omar Barada had said we weren't allowed to present our case, but the CAS document suggests we were given an opportunity to present our case, but we didn't. We only sent Ferran Soriano to that meeting, not the other 5 or 6 people they'd asked for. And the other one was the failure to provide the documents that UEFA had asked for. But we provided everything to CAS. Everything that UEFA had asked for that we'd not provided, that CAS agreed that we were guilty of, we provided to CAS. So again, someone has said City accepted this settlement in full. I've not seen that particularly. I did hear a whisper that they might be thinking about an appeal depending on what was in the judgment. That was after the initial decision came out. And it wouldn't shock me totally. City may decide to let sleeping dogs lie and take it on the chin. But it wouldn't shock me if City were to appeal on those grounds, because they obviously thought they had good grounds for not cooperating in the first place, and eventually they did cooperate. So everything we've been fined €10 million for, and the reason UEFA proposed that fine was it had to be seen as a serious deterrent to other clubs who might not cooperate in future. So it couldn't just be a slap on the wrist. And because we were a rich club, despite the fact we've had no money in for 3 months like most other clubs, it had to be a serious slap on the wrist. So hence the 10 million. If it had been Bournemouth, it might have been €100,000 or something like that. But because it was us, it was €10 million. So it'd be interesting to see what we do about that. But basically, that was there was another interesting bit actually. Finally, we had asked that if we were found in breach of any of this, that we wanted to make another written submission. And CAS said there was no point in doing this. So basically, this was irrelevant, and they had no intention of allowing that. So we don't know what that written submission would have been. It might have been something very, very crucial. It might be something about finances. I don't know. But basically, I mean, let's go back through these 10 and really sum them up. So the core allegation about Etisalat sponsorships being disguised equity funding was false. That was our assertion was correct. The hacked emails provide no proper factual basis for the adjudicatory chamber's decision. CAS found in our favour on that one. And again mentioned, one of the things CAS mentioned was that UEFA were entitled to draw an inference from these emails, but just because something was written in an email didn't mean it had happened or would happen. So one of the emails highlighted was from 2010, before even financial fair play had been introduced. And the point that Kaz made quite correctly was, City made, that was they were discussing an arrangement of funding by Abu Dhabi United Group, which wasn't actually illegal at that point under FFP. So, to show that email, and Kaz made the point that, no, it wasn't. The first two payments weren't illegal, wouldn't have been illegal because it was a quite proper arrangement because FFP wasn't in place. The third one might have been illegal under financial fair play, but you've got no evidence that anything haven't got the evidence that nothing changed in the meantime. So again, that was one of the grounds that Kaz found these 6 emails, seven really, were not enough to find their case. Was that just because it says something in an email, someone might be asking a question, and I think I made this point. Whoever it was asking what the flow of funds was it ADUG, sponsor, City, or ADUG, whatever the chain was, we never saw the response to that. We never said, no, it's not coming from ADUG, or if it is coming from ADUG, the sponsor is sponsor ADUG City. So we never saw the response to that, which kind of proves Kaz's point. So the case, the emails provided no proper factual basis for the EC decision. Yes, we're right on that one. The case against us is based on inference, whereas the adjudicative chamber declared it was comfortably satisfied that the documents were evidence of these arrangements. Again, it found it was comfortably satisfied that the documents weren't evidence of these arrangements. So that's 3 out of 3 we've won. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Etisalat met their sponsorship obligations in full. Again, that's another one we get a tick in the box for. The case is commercially irrational. Again, Kaz found against us on that one, but it didn't matter because that was kind of rendered irrelevant by the fact that Kaz found that Etihad paid their full sponsorship agreement and they got full sponsorship rights for that one. So we weren't giving them something for nothing. Anyway, so number 5 goes completely. They found against us, but has no relevance whatsoever. Number 6, the alleged breaches are in any event settled and time barred. Well, obviously we know that Kaz found for the first part of that they weren't settled. So again, we lost that, but some were time barred, but the rest weren't. So we sort of lost on that. But what he did was allow Kaz to look at some of these arrangements and found that they didn't break any rules. So again, we kind of lost that one, but it was ultimately led to a win. So, it's taking 1 step back and 2 steps forwards. Accounting and the accrual accounting basis, that wasn't even examined. So, but basically it falls under the, yes, we did everything properly heading. The alleged non-cooperation by the club, this is the only significant point that Kaz found for UEFA and against us. The CFCB abused its obligation on due process. Again, Kaz said it hadn't, but that didn't matter because they were now the process. And the proportionality of the sanction, and again, Kaz removed the ban and reduced the fine by 2/3. So a little bit of a win for UEFA, but mainly a win for us on that. So UEFA charged us under 7 different articles of financial fair play, and only on one of those, Article 56, which was non-cooperation. And the only charge they brought after they tried to speak to us. So when it went to the adjudicatory chamber, they brought this charge of non-cooperation. So it wasn't one of the original charges they approached us for in March 2019 because they hadn't approached us for cooperation. So on every substantive charge that UEFA brought against us, we succeeded in our appeal. So if anyone's got any questions, so one last point. Again, we said people like Barney Roney were tweeting FFP RIP. and a few commentators who should know better were saying this is the death of financial fair play. Quite clearly from the judgment isn't. What it does show, actually, it works in UEFA's favour, because it does show that there are certain clauses and things in there that they actually need to tighten up to make them more legally watertight, because there were stuff about this 5-year limitation. It wasn't clear. There were stuff about perhaps the non-cooperation, where Article 56, which is very widely written. So maybe there are challenges to that. But the core financial fair play, anyone saying it renders financial fair play inoperable is absolutely wrong, because what it showed is that financial fair play basically, we've not challenged the basis of financial fair play. As I've said before, we've challenged this on legal and accounting basis, not on the core rationale for financial fair play and the core requirements, the break-even requirement. We've met all those. We've no intention of trying to breach those. We've not used any underhand method to breach those. And UEFA may want to go away and look at tightening them up, but it has shown there are one or two loose wordings within the regulations, and that's the best that UEFA got out of that in terms of the death of financial fair play.
Is it at this point we go, get in there, City, get in? No, I mean,
yes, a fairly whatever people are saying, technical victory, but moral.
To give a football analogy, the ball was well over the line. We didn't need goal line technology. The ball was in the back of the net, nestling in that onion bag. We didn't need any VAR or anything. It was.
But if you're going to use that analogy, it's like the John Stones goal line clearance against Liverpool. Yeah, there was a bit. Most of the ball was over the line, but there was a bit that wasn't, and that was UEFA's bit, the bit that wasn't. And in the end, of all the substantive charges that were brought at the start of this, apart from Article 56, which was brought at the end of the investigation process, we escaped punishment on and were found cleared of.
Escaped punishment, did we?
It's interesting, isn't it, guys, that in the whole case against us that CAS were adjudicating, you can talk about City being obstructive, and you can talk about the admissibility of the emails and everything else, but the core of it was whether City had inflated sponsorship revenue. And Stefan Borson made the point that when CAS dealt with that in the document, the phrase "no evidence" was used 12 times.
Yeah.
And he made the second point that people should take out of this is that even if you granted credence to some of the theories regarding whether or not City did this, just because you talk or appear to talk about it doesn't mean you did it. And this is the thing. This is the thing that people can't get their heads around, especially certain journalists, that even where emails made it look like City were discussing or thinking about doing something that appeared nefarious, this is not evidence that they actually did it. Whereas when they saw these emails and thought that various comments looked like they were hovering on the edge of planning something nefarious, you can't make the leap, even if you accept that, even if you believe it, you can't make the assumption that these things were then carried out. And that's where this continued repetition of the phrase "no evidence, no evidence, no evidence" came in.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
It was a 2-1 majority verdict. It wasn't unanimous. And I think some people, the naysayers, they leap at that and say we were lucky. It could have gone the other way. It was only 2-1. It was a judge's decision. Can you explain what that means?
Well, I can try. I mean, so people have assumed it's a 2-1. We're not exactly sure, but in some parts of the judgment, it says the majority of the panel was satisfied, or majority of the panel weren't satisfied. In other parts of the judgment, it said the panel was satisfied or the panel weren't satisfied. So again, there were 3 arbitrators on there. And in any legal judgment, you may get a dissenting opinion. CAS doesn't publish dissenting opinions, so we don't know who dissented, if anyone did, or why. So the temptation is to assume that UEFA's pick, Professor Haas, was the dissenting opinion. We can't make that assumption. We cannot make that assumption because we don't know. We also, I don't know. We don't know what they dissented on. Did two of them say, "Oh, that's definitely happened," and one said it definitely didn't happen, or did two of them say that definitely happened? Did one say, "I'm not quite so sure"? I don't want to say it definitely happened. I don't want to say it didn't happen. So we don't know. We're making an assumption about the quantitative decision. We're making a huge leap from a qualitative point of view that the dissenting voice was, "No, you're wrong," because it could be, "I'm not sure you're right," if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is not the US Supreme Court where you get to read the dissenting opinions.
No.
But Colin, could we go on to what happened next? Because Der Spiegel weren't finished, were they?
No. Der Spiegel certainly weren't finished. I mean, it would take us probably half a day to go through the full CAS judgment. But one of the things that UEFA made its case on was they were trying to allege that Simon Pearce was the instigator of many of these deals. So basically, he was pulling the string. Now Simon Pearce is an non-executive director at City, but clearly has a hand in affairs. Simon Pearce is also a key member of the Executive Affairs Authority of the Abu Dhabi government. The Executive Affairs Authority is basically an agency which sits off the ruling Executive Council, and it's the umbrella organisation for, I think, 6 or 7 different committees or agencies which basically supply the strategic direction for life in Abu Dhabi's kind of future and way of life. So the implication was, I think they were trying to quite clear what they were trying to prove, but maybe about the related party, because if it could be shown that Simon Pearce is telling Etihad what to do and telling Etisalat what to do and doing it on behalf of City, there's probably a great case for making this a kind of a manufactured arrangement, I guess, that wasn't a true sponsorship arrangement. Now, to me, it's a bit specious, and the judgment showed it to be a bit specious. But in his witness statement, Pearce emphatically denied, and CAS took him at his word, that he had arranged any contracts between City and the sponsors. Okay, so basically, what they were saying was he could not force Etihad to make an arrangement with City to pay them £67.5 million a year, or 220 million. He couldn't sign the contracts. He wasn't Etihad. He wasn't Abu Dhabi United Group. He wasn't Etisalat. He might be the middleman, but he can't foot. It's what we just talked about, isn't it? The fact that he might be seen to be doing something doesn't mean he did it. So UEFA made great play of Simon Pearce as the man, the puppet master pulling all the strings here, and he denied that he was. And Der Spiegel, the day after, came out, released an email where Pearce is, I think, talking to the commercial director at Etihad about a mistake in the payments. And he's basically saying, "I owe you an amount of money." Now, they were trying to suggest that Pearce had perjured himself in his evidence to CAS, because in saying, "I don't arrange these contracts," here he was in an email saying, "Well, here you are, I owe you this amount of money." I mean, it was laughable, really, because, as I say, it covers the same principle of, because he said, "I owe you the money," didn't mean it was, if you took that literally, it was coming out of his pocket. What he meant was, as part of the sponsorship agreements, Etihad had paid X, he should have paid Y, or something like that, and therefore Etihad were owed a certain amount of money. Pearce, as the middleman, was basically saying there's been an accounting error and that money needs to go back to you. He used the term "I owe," but to read into that anything nefarious when he'd given evidence to say he wasn't the arranger is quite ludicrous and takes the meaning of inference to a whole new level, I think.
Colin, one question that people had when this new email was linked from Der Spiegel, which was basically suggesting that Pearce had lied to CAS. People were asking, and I don't think I've gotten a good answer to this so far, but they were saying, is it not possible for City to either reclaim the hacked emails or to demand that they be deleted? Because if that's not possible, what's to stop Der Spiegel publishing a new leaked email every week from now until the end of time?
Yeah, I don't know what legal path City can or will take on this. As I say, the Portuguese judge was quite clear that these should not be used, whereas Swiss law overrode him. I don't know about German law. People have potentially said, yeah, we should sue for our property. We should sue, I mean, in the broadest legal term of the word, for our property back. I don't know whether that's feasible or not. I don't know whether it has a bearing on the Rui Pinto case, or the Rui Pinto case, say, has a bearing on our legal options for that. So I don't know what will happen, basically, in terms of what happens with emails. But, think about this. Der Spiegel had 5.5 million documents, and all they could produce was 7. And they had to doctor 2 of those to make them look worse than they were. Even David Conn. I spoke to David Conn at a Football Writers Festival event, I think it was about a year ago. And we were talking about this. So it must have been after they came out. And even he said, I just don't see the smoking. There's no smoking gun in there. I spoke to our friend Kevin Maguire on this. Kevin's pretty well regarded in the kind of football finance industry. Ray, of course you were there, of course, Ray. Kevin said, there's nothing in those emails. So they had... How long have they had those emails? 5 years? 4 years? 5 years? I don't know.
At least
and they searched through them. They got a whole team working on them. And all they could find with those 6 emails, there was no smoking gun in there. Absolutely not. So they can produce 1 a day for the next, however, to the end of time, till the sun explodes into a black hole or whatever suns do. But nothing is going to change unless they can find an absolute smoking gun in there. I don't think, which they would have found by now. Nothing is going to change. No one's going to go back to CAS and reopen all this.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether yourself or Ray were aware of any other cases where emails were stolen that form part of a court case, and then do the offended party not have any recourse to insist that these stolen emails be deleted? I mean, it seems a bit odd that someone can hack your system, steal your emails, bring allegations against you, and you have no way to silence them. If you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I don't. It's this thing about journalism as well. So, and journalists who, they've got them by whatever means. I obviously don't know enough about this, and obviously German law can be different to Swiss law, to French law, and to UK law or English law. So I don't know anything about it, not even enough about that to be able to comment. You get your property back. You'd like to think that.
Yeah, it may be that just to try to give an answer to that it will only come with the prosecution of Mr. Pinto, that anything like that might happen, I guess.
Well, he's passed on his stolen property. I mean, you might be right there, Mike, because if in Portugal if this is prosecuted and the stuff is stolen from City, in Portugal they say that's been stolen, you're going in the clink for a very long time, and you must return the stolen property. Maybe that has a knock-on effect, and that means whoever is given that stolen property to has to return it. But we've seen I'm sure we've seen many cases where there's been big data dumps of hacked, stolen emails from all sorts of different bodies, and then journalists around the world get their hands on them, and then they disseminate it, and they come out with their own stories. We've seen that with The Guardian, and we've seen it in America. I think if you look at Mr. Julian Assange and some others in America, and they never give them back, and then no one makes them. No one tries to make them give them back. They just ask for them. They don't get them, and then they just let it go. So I've got a feeling that I don't think there's much City can do about it. And how can you trust that someone's deleted all the evidence? It's just like having a file. How can you make sure that the 20 people who've got it have all deleted it? You can't.
If only Hillary Clinton was in on the case.
Yeah, I mean, the other point is why didn't Der Spiegel, again, we come back to this point, the UEFA were clearly relying on the stories in Der Spiegel, approached Der Spiegel for the emails and asked for them, and Der Spiegel refused. And I'm guessing that would be a legal issue if they handed them over, because then UEFA would be in receipt of stolen goods, and UEFA would be perpetrating that.
Yeah. They'd mean encouraging illegality then, wouldn't they?
One of the very, very interesting observations by Stefan Borson was that after poring through this document, I don't think that he had even finished reading it when comments were issued on Twitter by certain journalists, and he said that he found it extraordinary. He praised the amazing legal minds of these journalists who were able to digest a 93-page document of quite some considerable complexity in record time, and were able not only to digest it, but to draw conclusions from it and then put them out on Twitter.
were all those conclusions pointing in the same direction from all these different journalists? I mean, is it just a coincidence that, let's say 10 different journalists managed to speed read this in record time? I mean, I'll be honest, I gave up after about 8 pages. I'd had enough, and I just looked. I went to the back and looked at the conclusions because I'd had enough. But then, in the amount of time it took me to read 8 pages, several of these journalists had all managed to speed read it and decipher it and understand it. And okay, I'll go on a little aside. Knowing what we know about most of them journalists, they couldn't understand it. They haven't got the capacity to, and then they all seem to come to the same conclusion. It's just the coincidence of the mother of all coincidences. That is what I don't get. Okay, is the journalists, quite a few of these journalists. Okay, they're grasping. They got the fingernails on the cliff of this. They're about to fall off into the abyss, and they're still having a go. And the thing is, if it was the other way around and us fans were grasping into thin air, they would be laying into us. Yeah, they'd be having a go at us fans, calling us all sorts of names for trying to hold on to something that doesn't exist. And yet, when it's their turn, they're all moral and high and mighty that they're doing the right thing. There's very little for them to hold on to. Some of them have had the sense just to ignore, just to get off Twitter and social media for a couple of days, let it go, and not try and win a fight that's already been lost. Some of them have had the sense to do that. Others, like your Duncan Castles and a few others of Nick Harris's of this world, they will continue to keep fighting that fight when there's nothing left to fight and there's nothing they're going to win. Well, guys, it's been quite a long one. Is there anything else that we have failed to mention in what we've talked about so far?
I just think, were there any questions that?
Yeah, okay.
Weren't answered by.
One of the points that Duncan Castles made was that City had more or less agreed to certain things. He pointed out that City agreed that UEFA had a case to bring, and that seemed to sort of fly in the face a little bit of what Ferran Soriano had been saying prior to this. Was that an admission that you saw in the document, Colin?
Well, I think I said this, that one of the things in the CAS document said that they could understand why UEFA brought the case, but it was a weak case. So basically we talked about having irrefutable evidence of our innocence, and we produced that evidence eventually and were, found not guilty of having made these payments. So, I don't understand how on the one hand CAS can say UEFA had good grounds for bringing this case and then say they didn't make it. They didn't make the case. And they drew inferences from these emails that they were not entitled to. It seems kind of a little bit contradictory.
My next question, Colin, is do you believe that it is true that if City had presented all of the evidence to UEFA that they presented to CAS, that this could have all been avoided, or are you like me a little bit cynical about that?
Well, CAS suggested that had we presented all the evidence we presented to them to the adjudicatory chamber, that the possibility is we'd have been found not guilty. City clearly had their own reasons for not doing that. I don't know what those were. Maybe we'll find out in time. And
CAS extremely naive if they think that UEFA would have taken all the evidence that we'd given to CAS and come up with a different judgment. I think that's naivety.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with you, Ray. I think that City probably had very good reason to believe that they wouldn't have got a fair judgment, even if they had supplied all of the information that they ended up supplying to CAS. But the fact is,
that would have opened a door. It depends on what City thought UEFA's motives were. Were they generally trying to investigate something, or were they just fishing for evidence?
And that's why my conclusion to this, Colin, is even if I had been reading this document and I wasn't a City fan, and I'd been following the whole thing and saw that City had withheld information from UEFA, but then supplied it to CAS, and then got the win. My conclusion is, well played, guys. Well played.
City will be playing in the Champions League next season, so you've got to say City played it well. I mean, it was a bit of an Aguero moment in some ways, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Um,
indeed.
it went to the final whistle, but yeah, we always thought we had a case, and we stuck to that. And I think there were deep suspicions about UEFA's motives. When it came to, we always said when it came to an independent panel, they were confident. City were confident they would find us not guilty, effectively, and that's what happened.
Okay, guys. Okay. Well, that was absolutely fascinating to listen to Colin's perspective on this, and thankful also for the questions and the insights from Ray as well. But I fear that it might just be stretching the attentiveness of our listeners if we go on too much more on this. So I think it's probably a good idea to finish it up here, guys. We got the win, and that's the important thing. The result is that we are free now to follow our ambitions in the transfer window, if window is the correct word anymore. And if you want to find out and learn a lot more about what City are planning to do in this window, I recommend you go over to City Fan TV, which is Ray's channel, where he will pretty much every day keep you updated on everything that City are planning to do, could possibly do, and are doing in the transfer market now that we've got this monkey off our back. But yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this particular pod, guys. We will be back with you pretty shortly. So until then, I guess we better just say farewell and express our gratitude to our two contributors. First of all, you have been listening to King of the Kippax writer and City Matters Committee member, Colin Savage. Colin, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. I've got a bit of a sore throat now, but yeah, it's been great to be able to to have the time to have a good read of the document and then get my points across.
Okay. And also you've been listening to City Fan TV producer Ray. Ray, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's been great to listen at first hand to Colin's dissection of the report, not hear it in a condensed version. So it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, you'll be hearing from us at Bolt from the Blue again quite shortly, but we'll finish off for now in the usual way and say have one on us and up those blues.